Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off as people continue to roll in here. My name is Andrew Price. I'm President and CEO at Competitive Energy Services, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our Spring Energy Seminar, where we're going to do our best to bring some important trends in natural gas, electricity, and renewables into focus for you. On the agenda slide, and as we go through each of these sections, we're going to highlight several large transitions we have coming up in each of these markets. And just a very brief preview for you. The U.S. natural gas market, as some of you already know, is rapidly transitioning from a domestic market to a world market. This is thanks to our ability to export large amounts of natural gas. And as a result, our natural gas and our electricity prices are now being influenced by world events. The electrification of heating and transportation required to meet sustainability goals will require a significant expansion of our electric grid and a very radical shift in when the grid is most stressed over the next decade. And of course, for electrification to achieve our sustainability goals, we're going to need a significant change in how we generate most of our electricity, transitioning to renewables and other carbon-free generation sources. Accommodating these big market changes while at the same time making sure consumers have access to affordable and reliable energy. It's a big challenge and certainly a lot for us to cover today over the next hour, but we'll do our best to give you some takeaways as we go through each of these sections. Just a few logistical items to cover as we get started here. Please ask questions throughout as you think of them. There is a Q&A feature. You should hopefully see that at the bottom of your screen. Please type your questions in there. The seminar is being recorded, and we'll circulate a link to that recording to everybody who attends today. Finally, we do have a giveaway, I believe, that will be announced at the end of the seminar, so stay tuned to the end for that. And now, before I turn things over to my colleagues, I did want to just take a quick moment to introduce our service offerings to any of you that might not be familiar with us. CES is a full-service energy consulting firm. We have more than 800 clients across the US and Canada. And since our founding more than 2 decades ago, we've always been completely supplier neutral and product neutral. We work only for end users. Our services generally fall into the 3 broad categories we'll show here: strategic procurement assistance, discrete consulting projects, and data management and reporting. And for many of our largest clients, of course, we customize our scope of work across each of these 3 categories. We call these our full service clients. On the next slide, I also just wanted to quickly highlight our renewables and sustainability services. Similar to our traditional energy commodity market work, we provide a range of procurement, consulting, and reporting services relevant to on-site and off-site renewables, battery storage projects, greenhouse gas and energy master planning, and many related sustainability services. If anyone has questions about our services or capabilities, we'd be happy to answer those questions. So please follow up with any of us after the call today. With that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Keith Sampson, who's going to lead us into a review of natural gas markets. Keith?
Great, Andy. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Keith Sampson, Senior Vice President of the Energy Services Group here at CES. I'm going to talk to you today about the big picture of natural gas. I've sort of been I'm here to kick things off and let everybody know, why gas matters and what are the trends. As you're going to hear throughout this presentation, we're talking here again about supply and demand and how those 2 things affect, availability, price, and how all these things sort of interplay with our transition towards renewables. Natural gas is the linchpin to all of these energy commodity markets. Natural gas is predominantly used for electricity generation throughout the country, and things change where you are geographically as it relates to supply and demand. Availability of gas in the pipelines is different in different regions. But generally speaking, the things that affect supply will be production of natural gas. That's sort of critical to having the supply, and that's supplied through wells that are, involve drilling rigs, and a lot of the natural gas, majority of it these days comes from shale gas in different shale plays across the continental U.S. here in Canada. Uh, Pipelines to transport that produced gas, and certainly the economics of different fuel markets. Whether it's economic to produce more gas or less gas has a lot to do with the price of gas. That's going to ultimately impact inventory levels. These are measured every week, and definitely have an impact on the cost of natural gas in those markets. And then as renewables, sort of infiltrate and maybe replace natural gas in a variety of different ways, that's going to impact our supply. On the demand side, one of the key elements that affects demand is LNG exports, as Andy alluded to earlier, and we're going to talk about some more today. This shift that we have in technology for heating away from traditional fossil fuel heat, natural gas heat, and ultimately, the big demand component is that electricity generation that natural gas feeds. The impact of electrification, uh, causing more electricity to be needed, um, growing demand through um, AI and data center growth, but also oil, coal, nuclear. These are all things that affect our demand here domestically and across the globe. And speaking of where we are in terms of supply and price today domestically, the NYMEX New York Mercantile Exchange, uh, the Henry Hub price for natural gas, the price is shown here with the blue line, and the gray bars show you inventory levels. Inventory levels are measured against the 5-year average, and this goes back 5 years to show what has happened, and we could see this correlation between price and inventory levels. Back in 2019, we had high inventory, low price. Russia, Ukraine, the pandemic really kind of started a decline in production and a rise in price. And with that high price came additional production that ultimately drove inventories back up and price back down. And so one of the key takeaways here is just how sensitive these markets are to any disruptions in the supply or the demand components of the commodity itself. And more on that inventory levels, natural gas inventory levels across the country. Next slide. Have not only grown here to the U.S. inventory levels are here. European and Asian inventory levels have also grown. Coming out of the Russia invasion, Ukraine, coming out of the pandemic, we've now seen inventory levels. We compare the red line, which is the current, against the 5-year average, the gray range, and the blue line. Again, in U.S., EU, and Asia, all being well above or above that 5-year average. And the bullets on the left show you that where inventories were at 90% going into the winter, into this past winter. Europe in a similar situation. Again, just driving that point why prices have dropped from where they were 2 years ago during the peak of that Russian invasion and the start of that run up in price. So where is demand? Next slide is kind of an important piece. Looking back 2.5 decades at this demand line shown for U.S. natural gas, again, gas used for everything from heating to process to electricity generation. There's been a lot of discussions here about where this demand line is going to go in the future. There's a few different sort of trajectories we could take depending on the world economies, continued growth of demand through world economies. We could certainly see demand climb. Geopolitics always affects this, but the price of LNG, the competing price of oil and coal, and then the competing price and the competing availability of renewables are all going to put this demand line on some trajectory. Uh, many studies have shown perhaps lower, others show higher, and this is sort of where we're going to continue to track things going forward. Well, one thing's for certain on the next slide is that the U.S. has become the world's leader in LNG exports. We compare the U.S. here on this graph to other leading regions, and moving up from the bottom to the top here, the United States is poised to continue to supply this insatiable demand for liquefied natural gas across the globe, to fuel everything from electricity generation, to the various other uses. So where does this go from here? We project a bit forward here with the help of EIA as to where LNG exports are going to be in the future. And what the story shows here is that with LNG terminals constructed and in the process of being permitted, looking out into 2027, the U.S. is almost going to double the amount of LNG exports. And the most important part is this bottom bullet on the left, which tells us that the total exports are going to basically get to about 25% of domestic production. So all the gas we take out of the ground here in the U.S. Is going to get put on a ship and sent across the globe. That is going to put a significant demand on the fragile resource of natural gas, one that is pretty volatile, and as I've shown you, sort of reacts to the supply and demand picture. Looking ahead here to production, the production that's needed to meet that LNG demand, we look here at five plus years of demand, or excuse me, of production growth shown across the U.S. And we just reached historic highs at the end of 2023. A lot of that was driven by the fact that prices were at record levels, and so there was much incentive to produce more natural gas, thereby again re-emphasizing the point: the solution to high price was high price. But the thing that's really interesting in this is this point that the production cuts from producers have started to take have started to take their toll. We're seeing production cuts because of the declining price, and the concern here is that as these production cuts continue and LNG exports start to increase, will there be enough natural gas produced, and what will that do to the price of the NYMEX and of gas prices? So that's kind of a telling sign here. And that's kind of the U.S. look. The next slide takes a little bit more of a focused look at New England and our situation. This particular graph looks ahead 5 years at a few different regions here: Texas, Mid-Atlantic, and in New England. The high peaks are the winter, and the low valleys are the non-winter periods. And we pay a premium, is what this tells us, in the winter time, right? There's, we're comparable to other regions in the non-winter periods, but our winter is much greater, and that's because of our dependence on LNG prices, which, while they have declined from the peak of the Russian invasion, they're still two to 2.5 times higher than they were prior to that. And Charlie's going to show you a little bit more about electricity premiums associated with the winter. And I wanted to sort of highlight why this looks like a premium in the next slide. This slide is comparing the top section is the forward curves. Okay, so we're looking ahead, 10 years at the price of natural gas seasonally, This is, the loaded price at the burner tip, looking forward for the different regions, Mid-Atlantic, New England, and Texas. And what we see here is the winter price is much higher than the non-winter price, and again, not much higher than those other regions. So compare that price, that July price that we show here of 15.99, or the bar, the graph on the right here, or the table on the right where we show 10.79 winter, to what those actual prices have ended up at, looking back at the past 10 years on the spot market. And New England settles at $6.50 for the winter. January settling at 921 on the left hand side. Again, the point here made is that, that premium that we pay, that insurance premium, because of the unknowns of winter weather, availability of LNG, world price of LNG, all sort of result in us, having the speculative market is greater than the realized spot market for winter gas here, and that's in comparison to the other regions. So my last slide just talks a bit about my takeaways as I hand this off to Charlie to talk about electricity. It's important to think about pipeline costs and NYMEX costs separately. If you're kind of looking at comparing costs, there's a variety of different concepts out there for hedging, for covering risk, and one thing we kind of see on the future here is that as production, you know, continues to decline and LNG exports increase, the pricing seems to have more 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 opportunity to rise than it does to fall, as it comes out of that dip that we saw in February of 2024. Variety of different strategies, ceilings and caps. There's ways to leverage some spot market and still cover risk, and really think about that winter situation, because we know we're paying a premium for it. And more on what the impact of gas is here on electricity, I hand off to Charlie.
Thanks, Keith, and for letting me cover a commodity that everybody needs and loves here, electricity. And so piggybacking off of some of that background on natural gas is helpful, because besides the liquefied natural gas exports here in the US, the power markets have been the only real leading sector and growing sector for gas use in the United States. So you'll see on the left-hand side of the page here, power generation, or gas used for power generation in the US in a year, going from 8,000 BCF in 2010 to over 13,000 BCF in 2023, a 40% growth in the past decade. And on the right hand side, this is just showing overall gas use by sector in the United States. Gas is really the only significant sector seeing growth in gas use, I should say, or the power sector is. And most of these other sectors are seeing declining needs for gas in industrial and residential commercial use. So kind of a shining star here is gas for power. And that trend is consistent here in New England as well. We're showing here total generation, right around 100,000 megawatt hours per year across New England. Now more than half of that coming from natural gas, and that number has grown over the past decade. Kind of enforcing that dynamic and importance between the electric and gas markets. Some of the other notable changes as we look backward in time and here for New England are the declining generation from nuclear power, really minimal oil and coal generation throughout the year, and relatively overall small growth in renewables. On a percentage basis, it is significant, but small, but certainly growing part of the overall generation picture here for New England. So I guess what does this mean for the cost of electricity commodity, that which any customer here in New England, let's say, has to buy? So we wanted to put that in perspective, and what we're showing here is the sum of all the electricity supply components that might be reflected on an average customer invoice here in New England. And again, this is not including any delivery side components. So the largest cost component you'll see here is the generation piece, which again ties back to natural gas, and that's represented by the blue bars, looking backwards and forwards. The next largest cost components are the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS, represented by green, and Forward Capacity Market, or FCM, costs. So these are the three primary components in this overall supply cost picture, and we'll start going and cover each of those three. Again, starting with the generation piece, in this visual here, we're looking at future prices all months of calendar 2025, and where those future prices have traded over the past 5 years. Okay, so going back to the beginning of this time frame, start of COVID, the gas market was oversupplied. That triggered a decline in production. Those two elements are similar to where we are today, as Keith mentioned, relating to the gas market. The result of that and the economy and gas demand recovering throughout 2021 was kind of an increase in these electric futures prices, which you'll see here in the middle part of this timeline. When Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022, gas availability was a grave concern for Europe, and we saw those liquefied natural gas prices soar, and so did our power markets here in New England. So since kind of that peak period and at the end of 2021, these forward power markets have really settled and have established a new price floor, but that floor is elevated from where we were at the beginning of this timeline. So we're really looking for kind of an answer as to why that is. So on this next slide, we're really showing the same data for 2025 electric futures, but we've split that data into winter months in blue and non-winter months in red. And what you'll see here is that the price differential has grown and throughout this time frame, and that premium has become greater for those winter months. And this dynamic explains most of the increase since 2019. And as Keith alluded to, these prices remain volatile through the winter. And we do expect this dynamic to continue here in New England until some of the global issues resolve themselves. So that's kind of the generation picture. Switching over to the capacity market and generation capacity here in New England. Since the 1980s and early 1990s, we've had New England electric system peaks that were comparable between summer and winter. As we got into the 2000s, we started to see those summer peaks increasingly exceeding winter. Up to 2006, when we saw the highest ever load on the New England grid at 26 gigawatts, compared to winter in 2004, which was 23 gigawatts. So those two benchmarks are shown in the middle of this slide here. The 28 gigawatts, the line in orange showing the all-time summer peak in New England, and then the 23 gigawatts showing the all-time winter peak in 2004. Okay. So in early 2024, earlier this year, ISO New England released their 2050 transmission study that projected our summer peaks increasing by 2035 to just under 30 gigawatts. Okay, and that's what you'll see in the far left side of this chart. Those stacked bars representing a forecasted summer peak for 2035 at 29 gigawatts. But along the same timeline, ISO New England is projecting that our winter peaks are going to reach 35 gigawatts. And that's primarily due to the electrification of heating loads. But as you look further out along this study timeline out to 2050, we're seeing that winter peak, effectively double the 2006 summer peak, the all-time New England system peak record. So this is significant, and really, certainly there's a runway to this change, but that all to say our capacity markets here in New England are changing, will have to change, and that will also impact some of the peak day management strategies and ultimately some of the ISO rules we expect over the next decade. As I work towards a transition here, wanted to mention the renewables and renewable portfolio standards, or RPS. And I'll reference this nice visual from ISO's 2021 Future Grid Reliability Study, which took a look at the long-term forecast for electricity generation sources here in New England. So we're looking forward here, but also looking back. Okay. And you'll quickly notice that the region's kind of aggressive renewable portfolio standard as they exist today and goals throughout New England states have the electric sector transitioning quite significantly. And the big takeaways here are the projection for our gas use to drop considerably on an overall relative basis, and for that lost generation to come from new renewables. Okay. We're also seeing oil and coal generation go to zero, and a decline in nuclear generation. But the big story here is rapid growth in renewables that's being directed by each of the New England states' RPS targets, and that's going to continue to add cost on the supply side of the bill, but it's also going to kind of create and change new opportunities in the capacity and storage markets as this sector becomes one of the first to fully decarbonize. So takeaways for electricity, winter energy and electric costs will continue to remain volatile where we have kind of this lacking gas infrastructure and reliance on liquefied natural gas here in New England. And consumers who are electrifying and start to use more electricity during the winter will see their supply side charges increase. Those generation costs will increase. That same electrification will also have an effect on our New England capacity markets, with winter and summer peaks becoming more comparable in the next decade. And lastly, these RPS targets and rapid expansion of renewables over the coming decade, this is going to have ripple effects really across all portions of the electric supply bill, including the three we've talked about: the generation, the capacity, and your RPS costs. There's a lot more to unpack with renewables, so I've called in my colleague Zach to dive into that a little bit deeper.
Thanks, Charlie. Zach Bloom, Vice President, Head of Sustainability and Renewables, and I am lucky enough to talk about the least polarizing issue here, renewables. States agree, politics agree. It's pretty partisan. So as a way to kind of dip into this very large conversation about renewables, where they're heading, where they're going, we thought one of the most kind of pertinent ways to divvy this up is through a visual, the demand layer cake. And so Keith talked a little bit already about, demand increasing for gas. We have these pipeline constraints, which are going to remain. It causes the issues in the winter, and it's still domestic driven, but LNG, more and more will become a bigger part of this when it comes to the price in the winter because we lack that capacity. On the electric side, loads are increasing from electrification, on heating and transportation. All of these are across the US. We have local issues, but this is really across the country. A lot of cities, states are trying to grapple with the same issues. In New England here, for renewables, we have coal retirements, and renewable projects are being canceled or will face delays. And so thinking about this kind of demand layer cake, we thought we'd bring it all the way from the top down to the bottom, from federal policy at, FERC, individual ISOs trying to figure out how to maintain reliability, cost, and keep the lights on. States have their own policies, they have solicitations. We're seeing municipalities come up with their own ordinances. And then at the end of the day, there's the end user, the governance, both internal, but also, carbon accounting standards and, how decisions are made or impacted downstream. So we'll review these all in a little bit more detail. And we thought it'd be helpful to start with, the federal at the very top. And recently there was a FERC transmission order 1920, which required a 20-year regional transmission plan, with the two main pillars really being focused on reliability and economic benefits, with the assumption that there are cost sharing across all of these states and consumers that are benefiting. And one of the probably more controversial pieces is states will have limited authority to object. And so this should theoretically help planning and less delays, cancellations, and fighting between states over benefits. So we'll start by going into ISO New England a little bit more. Charlie talked about what we have generated, in the past, which is mainly coming from natural gas, and where we're getting to in the future, where there'll be a lot more renewable energy. But before we can get to actually generators, producing, you need to actually get into the queue. And so the starting point for what the future holds is looking at the ISO interconnection queue. Just because you get in there doesn't mean it will be built, but if you're not in there, it definitely won't. And so on the left-hand side, there's kind of the June 2017 interconnection queue. And what you can see is, natural gas is at 48%. So all the new, would be natural gas. Wind was at 44%, solar relatively small at 6%, and then other at 2%. Fast forward less than a decade, and natural gas is less than 1% in the interconnection queue. That has effectively been replaced by battery storage, which previously was just in the other category, less than 2% with a bunch of other technologies in there. Wind has went down a little bit, solar is almost doubled. And when we think about the wind, there's onshore wind, but that's really a small component. The big story is offshore wind. There's state contracts that were signed, between Connecticut, Mass, and Rhode Island for over 16,000 megawatts. So the plan to meet a lot of these state goals was really offshore wind, driven by state contracts. And so where do we stand? Well, this is a map really detailing in a little bit more where there's projects, what their status is. And, offshore wind sits nicely in between both ISOs and state level policy. So many of those sponsored, state contracts have been canceled, due to things like equipment delays and rising costs, which ultimately have left developers with PPA rates that are no longer in the money. So they've, terminated those agreements, and a lot of the delays here, are going to have downstream impacts. So these cancellations are not only occurring in New England, but we've also seen them in New York, New Jersey, and as multiple states, fall behind their goals, there's a new dynamic that's kind of emerging from these solicitations, which is if states outside of ISO New England, execute projects previously bid into state solicitations, what will that do to their neighboring states? You might not have all the projects that you originally thought, and if there's more competition, it kind of blurs the line a little bit with those dynamics. So the main question primarily, to what will happen next is, are these cost increases short-lived? Will the prices drop in the future? And if so, should states continue to try and meet their goals, knowing it might be costly for ratepayers? And if that's the case, then short-term goals will not be met and likely change the supply demand, not only for generation, but from renewable energy credits, the RECs coming out of those renewable portfolio standards. So this map is showing, offshore wind supply locations. As you can see in the legend, the blue parcels are the preferred, locations. The green are installed, and those little dots are related to proposed or installed substations. The green being offshore and the red being the onshore. We have had progress. Vineyard Wind construction has started, but it is behind what that announced construction schedule is. And so, where do we go from here? It is going to have quite an impact on each individual state's renewable portfolio standards, the RPS. So what we're showing here is a graph of the RPS, put into gigawatt hours. Each color represents the new class 1 resources by state, with the gray being the cumulative non-class 1, are already existing here. The dotted line at the top is showing, from a report that ISO New England puts out each year, called the CELT, the Capacity, Energy, and Load Forecast. And so this is taking, what the expected is, tying back to the historic, but also modeling both pluses and minuses. On the plus side, as has been mentioned, you have electrification needs. So people getting off of gas and oil and switching over to heating through electrification. Same thing on transportation, moving away from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, not only at the residential, but trickling into, commercial transportation, industrial, like all of these fleets in the future will be, instead of using gasoline or diesel, importing electricity from the grid. So this is going to increase quite a bit, what that load is. At the same time, there's energy efficiency. Many of the states in New England are in the top 10, nationwide for energy efficiency. And also solar, behind the meter assets. All of this will, be a decrease, but what we are showing is an expected net increase of 120,000 gigawatt hours, this year, out to the end of the decade, about 140,000 gigawatt hours. As that percent and volume increases, the amount that the RPS needs to meet, it is also going to increase. This means a lot, because if in the future, almost half of the supply is coming from renewables and it doesn't keep up, that will increase those REC prices, which if the REC price on a unit basis is increasing, it could mean quite a bit more cost for that RPS component that Charlie was showing in the stack bar chart for retail electricity. As we move away from more of the ISO level into state, policy, this is an example for Massachusetts. Most of the states by the end of the, by 2050, all have carbon neutral goals. Some will ramp up faster, in Massachusetts, for a end user, as an example, that wants to be 100% renewable for the electricity, i.e. have zero emissions for their scope 2, what they need to procure is the delta between, the green bars and 100%, the voluntary RECs. And so each year as that increases, the amount, assuming load stays fixed, will decrease. And so obviously load doesn't stay fixed. It changes depending on what type of business, commercial, residential changes occur, at those locations. And so it's a really complicated thing to figure out, and forecast. But what we do know is as those percentages increase, we'll need more and more renewables to come online to actually meet that demand. As we transition from the state level to one of the last two in the layer cake is a big change. This is municipal ordinances. And what we're showing here is across the country, many of these cities have actually created their own policies. Most of them, if not all of them, start off strictly just with benchmarking. Are you public? Are you over X square feet? Then each year there's an annual requirement with some sort of penalty for not reporting. The goal is really just to have information, set a baseline, understand if you're being efficient, which building specifically. Many of these ordinances have shifted. You can see in purple, these are the ones that have shifted to not an energy reporting disclosure ordinance, but a carbon-based ordinance. And that evolution essentially requires a baseline and a emissions reduction goal. A glide path each year of continued reductions. And if you don't meet those continued reductions, there's now penalties. In Boston, under BERTA, they have a $234 per metric ton of CO2e penalty for every metric ton not met. So this is no longer just a report, understand what's efficient, what needs to be worked on. This is a glide path that, if you don't perform, has financial penalties that come with it. New York, their local law also has one, $268. And these are going to continue to evolve over time. More and more municipalities that didn't have anything are starting in earnest to create their own reporting and likely to move in that direction. So you have really all these pressures from the state level to the municipal level, and then ultimately to the last level of that layer cake, which is the voluntary or the governance. So, corporations, municipalities, universities, if they have their own goals, are out there purchasing voluntary RECs. These are over and above what the RPS is mandating, and historically have come from unbundled RECs, existing generating facilities that sell in the spot market. They've already been built, so they don't really change what that grid mix is. And there's been a push really from end users, starting with corporates who start to meet those goals, lobbying to the World Resource Institute, which is the body that kind of created the framework for carbon accounting, the equivalent of GAAP accounting for financials, to say these are the rules, everyone's using the same kind of sheet of paper. And what the big push has been is, if you don't have something change, if there's a pre-existing renewable project that has those RECs and I buy them, what is the impact? And so this concept of additionality is, if not for my signing this agreement with a developer building a project, would it get built? And if it does get built, then the off-taker gets the RECs. But more importantly, it actually changes the renewable generation mix. And so we have the state contracts, but we also have lots of end users voluntarily entering into municipal CCAs or going direct to developers and signing for offtake from a solar or a wind project or a combination. And that's really the demand piece. We touched on the prices changing. and some of the reasons for the cancellations. We thought it would be interesting to show, this is a study that's been around for over 18 years now from Lazard, and it's a levelized cost of energy, per megawatt hour tracking of the different generating facilities. And each year they take a look at all the different factors from equipment to labor to the transmission subsidies and financing. And they run sensitivity analyses, they collect data from public or private bids, and they anonymize it and put it into this levelized costs per year so you can track. And it's important here because you can see the yellow, which is the solar, as well as the dark blue, the farthest to the bottom, for the better part of the last decade plus have been on a downward trend. Solar even more so, previously at 243 at the beginning of this period, all the way to $61 last year. But one of the big changes is as COVID started, there was a lot of impacts. There was tariffs that were being created. There was potentially the PTC and ITC, the tax credits from the federal government sunsetting, and of course labor supply issues, equipment issues. And so all these really drove the cost up. And what we've seen over the last 3 years, not just for renewables, but also coal and nuclear are increasing prices. And so of course, as it relates to renewables, it's an interesting trend to see it go from 36 to 60 in the last few years. And that's really the reason why a lot of these contracts have been canceled. They've had these delays that have started with a PPA rate signed a few years ago that's no longer in the money. And so they're canceling and trying to get out. So what does this mean, kind of the last piece here for REC pricing? It means we've seen this trend where what we're showing is since July 2021, through current, the class 1 RECs, the new RECs, by state, purple is Maine, yellow is Mass, red is Rhode Island, go from the mid 20s, up to all of them really being close to $40. This has been seen in solicitations that we've done as well. And the dotted lines above are the ACP, the alternative compliance payment. This is for load serving entities that don't comply with state rules and go out and get those RECs. They need to pay these penalties in lieu of procuring the RECs. And you can see really they've essentially went up to meet that lowest ACP rate, the $40. So pulling all this together here, what are the big takeaways for renewable energy? These delays have downstream consequences. If the generation doesn't come from renewables as expected, more and more of that natural gas power generation will continue to backfill and potentially increase in the short term, at least. Demand for RECs has increased not only from state, but also the municipal and kind of voluntary REC procurement to meet these self-driven or mandated goals. And the compliance costs for class 1 RECs are increasing. When Charlie showed that stack bar chart, RPS was close to a penny at the beginning. A decade plus, it was a fraction of a penny, 2, 3, 4 mils. And now we're seeing it get closer to 2 cents and likely to increase here over time. Yes, they don't require fuel renewables, but they do require all these other costs. And if we're purchasing them to meet these goals, and sometimes in suboptimal timeframes to meet, it continues to add up over time. We're not advocating either way. We're really just identifying what these levers are for price changes. And so what does it mean for an end user who's thinking about, procuring retail electricity? We see kind of an evolution here in the retail product market, where people who want to purchase renewable offtake generally have been going to developers, and those developers have signed an agreement, they get the financing, they get them built, and the offtake comes normally in the form of the megawatt hour on one side, the electron, and the REC on the other. A lot of the retail providers have been getting into this business as well. It could have just been purchasing greeny, unbundled RECs and marrying that with a brown electricity supply. But more and more, they're actually pairing local regional projects, the RECs that come with them, with their overall supply, or sleeving renewables into it. And so, being able to bring your solar or wind profile, if you already have offtake, or getting a product that includes those, I think more and more will be a product that's offered. And I think the last piece here is, as we've seen the electrons be the primary driver, if over time more and more renewables get installed, less gas, less oil, and those costs are coming down, the price of the electron will be cheaper and cheaper, with the capacity and the state programs and all these other components increasing. And the biggest one, I think, being in that existing stack, as I mentioned, RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard. If you can actually use those environmental commodities, just like everyday commodities, to purchase at the optimal time, you will be able to really maintain a lot more cost and budget certainty. And I think these projects will certainly evolve over time. So with that, we wanted to, thank everyone for coming out, and we'll open up for questions. But before we get into the questions, I'm handing it back to Charlie for another announcement.
Yep. Thank you, Zach. Well done. I'm going to convert your takeaways into a giveaway, and in a kind of appreciation and recognition of everyone attending here, we give some small gifts to those who register for the seminar first. We've got 3 people that signed up this year. We interpret this as enthusiasm for the topic, but this year we've got the first 3 to register. We'll send you a small gift next week. Chuck Doherty, Don Sikowski, who that's 3 years in a row for Don, so congrats to him, and Scott Martell. But thanks to everyone, and yeah, we've got a few extra minutes here before we wrap. So we did get some Q&A that came in. Please continue to feel free to use the Q&A there. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Keith, I'm going to tee you up for this first one. The question is, can you explain more why global LNG prices drive winter electric costs, and why is capacity such a small price component? There's a third question there relating to fuel switching, and why that isn't more of an issue here.
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. It's the right question. Zach, can you just go to slide 22? It kind of explains in a little bit more of the response here. So the point's made. LNG import is a really, really small fraction of the total grid even during these winter moments. The other capacity, the other electricity generation has been made up by oil and primarily oil, a little bit of coal. Obviously, demand response is a piece that helps out when we have critical times on the electricity grid. So that's fuel switching. It's all happening because we don't have enough interstate pipeline capacity. So we have to supplement with something. But at the end of the day, the extreme end of that spectrum is importing LNG, and the cost to do so. It is a supply and demand market, and on a very cold day, ISO New England is doing just that, auctioning off the generation that's needed, and it goes to the stack of bidders least expensive to most. And as more generation, as more fuel is needed, that sort of ratchets up the stack. So you could call it price gouging, but it's mostly just supply and demand. There's ways to offset that. Obviously, we have strategies using alternative fuels or just coming off the grid, reducing load. But one thing is clear in this graph is that before the Russia-Ukraine invasion, before price of world LNG skyrocketed, the difference between winter and summer in New England was smaller than it is today. And if you overlaid an oil graph or a coal graph on top of this, the price would be virtually the same. So it isn't those other fuel switchings. It has got to be the LNG just by default. Thanks. Thanks for your question.
Thanks, Keith. Another question came in about the economics of renewables versus nuclear. Andy, I'm going to tee you up there.
Another good question, and one that we certainly get a lot. And we have some near-term data points, and Zach had a slide that showed a good comparison here also. So a new nuclear plant was just finalized and came online in Georgia, and it was enormously expensive. It was $35 billion plus for this facility. The estimates of the levelized cost of energy over its lifetime was pretty consistent with what's shown on this graph, around $180 per megawatt hour. And the issue with that facility is that it was a one-off. We haven't built nuclear plants recently. The great benefit of nuclear, of course, is its base load. It's 24/7. It provides carbon-free renewable or carbon-free electricity overnight and during the dark days of winter in a way that, of course, solar doesn't. Solar and wind, you can see here, are much, much cheaper, about a third the cost, but obviously are not always generating. So they need to be backed up by resources in certain situations. So the costs between the two are not directly comparable. There's definitely a resurgence in interest in nuclear in the US. There are people working on smaller modular reactors, SMRs they're called, which hopefully would bring the cost down. And I think the crux there is, building them on a large enough scale, enough of them, that the costs come down. And that's not something we've had any ability to do in the US. Permitting is a challenge, of course, with nuclear. And so it's an area to watch, but currently, very few new nuclear plants being worked on in the US, and costs are still high there. So good question.
Thanks, Andy. We had a couple questions along the lines of renewables and renewables costs. Why RPS is driving up supply costs, given the levelized cost of generation you shared, and then the likelihood of some of the proposed offshore projects, given the prices that were bid in. Wanted to get your take on that.
Yeah, I'll take the RPS one first, and I guess by way of the slide that's already up, the levelized, these are across the country. Of course, in the Midwest for wind is a much better resource, and so lower on average than what we might see in New England for both onshore and offshore. With the RPS component, I had shown the REC pricing. If you go back 2 decades, a decade plus, the RPS percent was 10%. And if the class 1 RECs at that time were $10 to $20, you're talking about $1, $2 per megawatt hour. Of course, if we stayed just in that same fixed rate of $10 and went up to where some states are, close to 50%, that's $5 per megawatt hour. But of course, they've went up to 40, and so now you're talking about $20. So this is where the unit cost and availability really changes. What is in that RPS retail stack, pretty substantially. These are state-driven goals, state programs, and they're shared across the end users who use electricity. So that's why we're seeing or saying that it's going to increase the component of RPS in that stack. You know, the other question here, you know, for offshore wind, you know, and they're escalating, is this a good decision? Doesn't seem like regulators would approve it. This is the crux of the issue. As these costs increase, if you want to maintain state goals, you need to pay this premium. Just a few years back, we saw prices that were $20, $30, $40 per megawatt hour in a PPA rate lower. And so you can pay a higher price, stay on the state path, or you could do a little bit and then continue to wait for that dip. Likely it'll be less cost for, you know, all the end users, but then it will delay some of the projects. And of course, these are also state contracts being approved at a legislative level. And so there are different ways that they're collecting this money, not only, you know, through the state contract, but the utilities are able to recoup some of those. And I think there's also likely some benefits coming from the ITC and PTC, in addition to the cost sharing coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act, where it's not just the owner of the projects that can claim the ITC or PTC. They're now going to focus on, or there's a fight to allow individual developers, like a transmission developer, to still get those federal incentives, even if they don't own a wind project or solar project that's interconnecting. And so similar to how battery storage has evolved for those incentives, I think transmission will. So there's all sorts of pieces of the puzzle here that are changing over time that will dictate what those prices are, and what decisions these states will make is yet to be determined.
Yep, that's fair. And thanks to everyone for participating today. That's going to conclude our hour. And for those that we didn't get answers out to, we'll be following up, and please do reach out if anything comes to mind. We're always here and happy to be a resource for any questions and for your support. So thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.